Hi everybody, it's Pete here from See Your Toes again, and this is podcast number 36. Again, it's been divided into two podcasts, number 36 and number 37, because the entire podcast conversation goes for quite a while, and so we've broken it into two halves that are each about 42 minutes long. It's about a psych nurse who is working in the public health system, and she found it quite difficult through a long period of time just dealing with patients in a position where she was giving them medications but never really helping them, and she realized the more meds she gave them, the worse they got. And then, as a cruel twist of fate, she was diagnosed with her own depression that was based around basically burning out from her job. So she ended up being on antidepressive medication for that. And before she knew it, she had one problem after another until she was on a bunch of medications and was sliding down a very dark hole over a period of years. This is her story of how she escaped that slippery slide and got herself back together, to the extent that now she's still a psych professional, but she's dealing with other people. She's not just dealing with giving people medications, she's making people actually better, putting their mental illnesses into remission. This is her story. Her name's Neseret Bemient, and I think you'll find this quite a poignant story. Thank you.
We can't really separate, mental health, physical health, spirituality, mindset, all those things, they're all interconnected. So if a person is struggling physically, because they've gained so much weight for various reasons, it could be because of side effects of medications, or perhaps they haven't been taught about nutrition. I think most of us haven't really. What is the proper human diet? Yeah. And so people gain weight, and then that impacts, you described on your website, it impacts every aspect of a person's life. Our physical, sort of that metabolic health, relationships, sexual functioning, work functioning, all of it. And so it's not separate. We like to separate, Western medicine and psychiatry, the brain from the body and the mind from spirit, or all of that, but it's really all integrated.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting comment there too, because I said in my last podcast, especially with mental health, and hey, I'm the novice in this conversation, but with mental health, people love to stick anything in a box. Oh, you've got schizophrenia. Oh, you've got bipolar. Oh, you've got, instead of, or have you just got symptoms for a whole bunch of those illnesses? And I think humans just love to put everything in a box, and then it can be easier to understand, I guess, if it's in a single box.
That is an interesting observation, because I think a diagnosis is a tool for clinicians to understand what the problems are with a client. But a lot of the times, it's not entirely accurate, always, because it doesn't encompass, like you said, every aspect of a person's life. But the other piece is it also can be empowering or disempowering to the person, whichever way you look at it. But yeah, we like to have, when you're trying to understand a problem, there was a saying in indigenous cultures, if you think you know what it is, you're wrong. And and if you think, you truly understand what's going on, you still have a lot way to go, because human beings are complex. Our brain and our bodies are incredibly complex. It's one of the most sophisticated machinery. And so to understand that on an emotional, physical, spiritual level, it takes a lot of curiosity and patience and persistence, and looking at it from many different perspectives to truly understand what's actually going on. And in Western medicine and psychiatry, we don't have time to do that. It's easy to put a label and prescribe. That's what you can do in about 7 minutes on average for physicians, and an hour for psychiatrists.
That's right. And then, of course, from there, and like the cardiologist is never going to talk to the therapist, and yet if the two are a metabolic disorder that could have the same same grounding, the same start, let's call it the start line, and they never talk to each other, then they're always going to be treated as two separate entities when they could very well be completely related, of course, couldn't they?
Oh, for sure. I think there's a huge silos and miscommunication or lack of communication between different um, sort of disciplines in the healthcare system. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think all of those perspectives, not only from professionals, but even informal supports as family members, can be incredibly helpful to allow you to see the person from different sides and understand the problem from different sides. So the system is not perfect, and definitely people struggle with really navigating that traditional conventional mental health and medical system, and sometimes people feel like they lose their sanity in that process.
Yeah, I can understand that. So Neseret, your surname is Bemient. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's Neseret Bemient. Correct.
Neseret. Right. Sorry, I got your first name wrong, and I thought I had that sorted out. So thank you for coming onto my podcast channel. I appreciate the time you've given me. So I've had a few people on as guests who have had serious mental health issues and have put them into remission largely. They've managed to get them under control for what they can understand. And so I've been working so far with people who have been the patient, if you like. And so it's interesting to talk to you, who you're at the other end. You're the therapist. Is that correct? Would that be is that how you view yourself?
Well, I basically have had an experience as a psychiatric nurse, a registered nurse in the Canadian mental health system for 17 years. And currently, I basically do coaching and consulting. I actually I'm no longer in that profession just because there's many reasons, and we can get into it during our interview.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I use my experience from the past, from the time that I've worked in the conventional system to support people as they navigate the current mental health system, like I said, without losing their sanity, and also implementing holistic approaches and including the ketogenic diet to improve their health.
Nice. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Would that be a good start to tell me a little bit about your history and stuff?
Absolutely. Sure. So I have kind of two interesting perspectives. One is a professional perspective, and the other one is a personal perspective. My professional background is I graduated from university with a Bachelor of Science nursing degree in 2006. And my first 4 years, I worked in an acute care unit, essentially where you see everybody at the height of their illness, people who are struggling with anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, eating disorder, OCD. It was a catch-all unit. Yep. I would say that was when my real education started. And I learned a lot in that process. I also, during that time, in the first 10 years, I worked with the adult population. So I worked in a methadone clinic for a couple of years with individuals who have severe opiate addiction. I worked with the homeless population, volunteered at a Salvation Army for a couple of years. I also did outpatient case management as a community mental health nurse for 5 years. So I had a range of experiences. The only thing that I've practiced is psych nursing. And then the 7 years after that, I worked with the pediatric population. So this was 6 of those years was in an emergency department, and then 2 years in a treatment center for kids who have concurrent disorders. And that was a very interesting perspective. I feel like our youth and their parents are in absolute peril. I mean, mental health is a fully blown public health crisis around the world. There's about 1 billion people who suffer from various mental health and addictions issues. And the second leading cause of death for youth between ages 14 and 24 is suicide, besides
Wow.
number one being motor vehicle accidents.
Wow.
So I had a very interesting kind of spans of experiences to look at both sides and really understand the current mental health system, the Canadian system, but I think there's a lot of similarities in many places. The issues and problems that we're facing are very similar. And so I had that experience, and I knew from the beginning that there was something amiss in the way we approach mental illness and the narrative of like, you have an illness, an individual has an illness or some brain chemical imbalance, and the solution is heavily on the side of the biomedical model, which is we're going to diagnose you, and then you have a chronic condition, you have mental illness, this is lifelong, and you're going to need to be on these medications for life. One of my main roles as a psych nurse was to administer and monitor psychiatric medications. And so while I was going through the whole process, I noticed there was huge issues with medications. Medications can be helpful, especially in acute crisis and in a small period, brief stabilization period. And that is supposed to be a temporary measure, really, until a person implements other holistic alternative approaches to get them to a place where they have enough coping skills to move forward in their lives. But that's not the way it's used. And so I knew from the beginning that people were coming to me, and many of them saying, these medications are causing problems for me. Like you understand, like with metabolic syndrome, where a person will gain, 100 pounds in some neuroleptic within 3-6 months. And then now they have their blood sugar is high. So then they're on, blood pressure medication or diabetes medication. And so there's a huge issue with polypharmacy in psychiatry. And there's also a huge issue with non-compliance. People just will stop their medications or discontinue them and end up going into withdrawal symptoms. So it's a bit of a mess. And I think there's also many people who are misdiagnosed from the get-go because they're going through grief and loss or a trauma response, a medical condition that's not ruled out. Normal developmental milestones that children go through is, kids not listening to their teachers at school, not sitting still, being seen as, as pathology. The same with those tumultuous years of adolescence where kids are going through and experiencing this huge transformation and rite of passage, but that's looked at as an illness at times. And so there's a huge range of problems, I realized, along the way that became more prominent and started to cause a real conflict within me as a clinician. So that's kind of the summary of the professional side of things. That is just to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of my experience as a clinician.
Just to interrupt there, I would have thought it would be a very frustrating profession because especially at that stage where all you have as an arsenal is to chat with these people and give them another med that is going to have all sorts of side effects. And especially if these people are told that this is your life, this is what you can expect for the rest of your life. It must be harrowing for the people, and it must be really, I would have thought, really depressing for you as the clinician.
It was definitely incredibly challenging to witness people languishing through the system and struggling and suffering and continuing to suffer. Not only maybe their psychiatric symptoms are not addressed or fully understood and kind of helped, but now they have to contend with the effects of these medications, which compromise their physical health, their relationships, their functionings at home, at
Yeah.
work, at school. And so it was incredibly difficult. And as well, when you look at the youth that are being diagnosed initially, and for some people, a diagnosis comes as a relief in the beginning. But you think about a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old being told you have this incurable lifelong illness, you're going to have to be on these medications. And this is not something, it can be helped, but this is an issue that you're going to have. And it can be incredibly devastating for them. And to
Yeah.
me, that is a bit irresponsible. And also, it's predicting and limiting a person. And even though I know the system, the system tries to promote, anti-stigma, this whole idea of belonging to this community and having to be a member of it, whether you like it or not, for the rest of your life, that kind of narrative actually becomes stigmatizing and disempowering to people in the long term. And the lens from which you view the person and the problem is from a very narrow lens of an individual, an illness being in their brain chemistry or just in the person. But the truth of it is, people are not islands. They come out of family dynamics most of the time that are very challenging and difficult. Most of the people that I've worked with over the years had significant history of trauma. They come out of communities, a culture that there are many forces that act on a person's health and well-being, not just, many indigenous cultures look at it that way, that from that broader perspective of what actually influences health, as opposed to this narrow focus on an individual and an illness just originating in their body and mind.
Yeah. So, and it must be so annoying knowing that certainly for most of those physicians then, and for you at that stage, it's kind of like, I can't make you better. I can only make your symptoms feel a bit better in the short run. And I'm not going to mention that your symptoms in the long run are probably going to make you feel worse in so many different ways. Especially if you're a 20-year-old and your sex life goes down the gurgler for a start because of the drugs you're on, and you put on copious quantities of weight, which makes you feel even more, like you've said, even more stigmatized in society. And you're just sitting back thinking, what can I do? My hands are tied. So.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It can be disheartening to witness that in a person, especially a young person, where they feel like they have lost hope, right?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to empower a person and say, you can do this and this and this. There's 1,000 paths to healing, and there's many things you can implement, and medication can be a part of that journey, and it can be helpful sometimes. It's not to minimize that, and I'm not against medications. But when it's looked at as that is the one size fit all approach for every person, and all of these other things that can be implemented are not thoroughly or adequately explored, so that the person can take control of their own lives and not depend on the psychiatrist or a medication or something outside of themselves to be able to function. And so to me, that limits a person, and it's disempowering. And people do feel like they're trapped in a way, because the interesting thing about psychiatry is that we claim to treat the brain. We don't look at it. There's no tests or scans that are done to actually really show this is what's going on. But the other piece is, people are told in one breath, these are powerful medications that are going to change your brain chemistry, that are going to affect your metabolism. But then they're told, don't worry, they're safe and there's no problems. But the truth of it is, the brain develops dependency on these drugs. Some of these drugs are sold on the street. There's no difference between the drugs that are sold on the streets and psychiatric medication. They're all under the umbrella of psychoactive drugs, which means they act on the central nervous system, which means even if it's prescribed by your physicians or by a psychiatrist, your brain will develop dependency on it, because what happens is when people try to reduce that medication or stop that medication, they go into withdrawal. And some
Yep.
of it can be severe,
Mm.
incredibly severe. And often those are misdiagnosed as a relapse of the original illness or an onset of a new illness. And that is something that I experienced in my own life. I was treated with an antidepressant when I was 30 years old, and I was in burnout because after working 4 years in acute care, and I also had an undiagnosed and untreated hypothyroid or low thyroid problem.
Right.
And the physician put me on a medication for the hypothyroid and also antidepressant at the same time, which the protocol would have been rule out the medical condition first and treat that, and then see if the psychiatric symptoms resolve. And within a couple of weeks, I became hypomanic, and I had never been hypomanic previously. So it was directly induced by the medication. And instead of also looking at as that is what happened, the suggestion was I was diagnosed again with an antidepressant induced bipolar disorder, and they added more medication into that cocktail.
It's like, sorry to interrupt you. It's like a movie where you're trapped. You're made into a prisoner, and they give you this, and this happens, and so then they give you that, and that happens, and then you end up just being this human guinea pig where they're just shoving more and more stuff down your throat. And at some stage there, you've got no escape because you've got no self-control at all because they have drugged you to the brim. It's a Stephen King movie, really, isn't it?
Oh, it's an absolute nightmare,
Mm.
because what happened after I was on that cocktail, and many of my clients, when they're left on high doses of medications for years and months and sometimes decades, my nightmare was 13 years. And I was
Wow.
on multiple psychiatric medications. I gained 20 pounds. Many of my clients can relate. There's weight gain. You experience brain fog, issues with memory and concentration. There is sexual side effects, and there is lack of motivation and energy, even though the clinicians tell you go and exercise and eat properly. These medications actually interfere with your metabolism, with your appetite, with your sleep cycle, with your sugar in your blood, with your blood pressure. And so you're in a state, and many people also experience suicidal ideation. And that was something that was incredibly disturbing to me. I had, during those 13 years, I had an intensifying suicidal ideation. And that has never been on my radar prior to being placed on an antidepressant. And another thing that is really incredibly disturbing for a certain group of people is that some of these medications cause permanent damage and permanent effects. And so this is not something that people are truly informed about before they are initiated on antidepressants or even just generally on psychiatric medications. Yeah. Clinicians often gloss over these types of impact, especially in long-term use. And people, like you said, they do feel trapped because now they can't get off of these medications, even if they wanted to. There is no practice of deprescribing and safe tapering in psychiatry. Often people are tapered too fast and they go into withdrawal, and then they're told, oh, your illness has, come back, or that you now have a new illness, a new diagnosis. That's usually more severe than the last one. And so I think people get absolutely trapped in the system. And probably besides, trauma being one of a huge factors that impacts people in terms of their mental health deteriorating, I'm starting to think that going through the mental health system is another major factor where people continue to deteriorate on that path. That is another risk. You get into the mental health system, you're going to get a litany of diagnoses, a litany of, medications. And this is not to discourage people from seeking help, but you have to go into it with an open mind. You can't go into this blindly or take it lightly. and or completely trust your mental health into physicians and mental health professionals.
It's interesting with your particular episode, and I'm sure it's the same with so many people. You went in, you were put on antidepressants, which gave you suicidal thoughts. It sounds a little bit of a catch-22 there. You know, not many people would think, I'm going to start antidepressants. Most people are going to think it'll make me feel better, not make me feel suicidal. That's a huge, and I guess that's just something that happens after a while, is it? It's not, you know, did you feel with your antidepressants, did you feel okay for a wee while and then it was a slow deterioration?
Well, no, actually, the thing is, the antidepressants and some psychiatric medications actually have something called the black box warning on all of them. And that the black box warning says that these medications have the potential to increase suicidal and homicidal ideation. And these types of warnings are very, like I said, glossed over and not truly discussed with people. And I have seen kids that have come in an emergency. 3 weeks ago, they've been placed on an SSRI by a physician, and now they're cutting and they're increased suicidal ideation. And when I ask them, have you discussed this? Did your family doctor or whoever placed you on this medication, it could be a pediatrician or a psychiatrist, have they discussed the black box warning with you? And most people would say, no, what is that?
Yeah, what's the black box
So
warning?
to me, that's irresponsible and reckless, but also handing out antidepressants like they're candy to children and vulnerable population that's already compromised is just not responsible or ethical or compassionate. I went, once I started the antidepressant, it was literally within 2 weeks that I became hypomanic. Now, some people will have a reaction to a medication from one dose, and some that is devastating impact. I was placed on a low dose medication, a mood stabilizer called Lamictal. And within about a week and to a week and a half, I developed a fatal condition called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So there's no way of knowing how you're going to react to a psychiatric medication. I think all medications come with risk. It depends on how a person responds to them. So for one person, that one dose might be deadly. And for another person, even a low dose can be really harmful. And so this is usually what happens in psychiatry, where people are trialed on so many medications because often people will have immediate reaction to them and not positive either.
No.
So they have to go through a litany of trial of different medications to actually find something that they can tolerate that doesn't give them horrific side effects and will actually ameliorate some of their symptoms. To me, even in those cases, that should be a temporary measure, not a long-term strategy.
With a lot of the doctors and so on, do they see mental health as being, how do you phrase this? As being mental as opposed to physical, mental as opposed to metabolic would be a way of phrasing it, maybe. Because I'm sure you view it now as, and I guess we'll get onto that, as a metabolic situation, whereas I guess a therapist generally would see it as a trauma situation that has, how do you say, upset the mental health of the person, but they wouldn't necessarily relate that to a metabolic health situation.
Well, yeah, I think this is something that you've said in the beginning of our conversation, is that we like to put people in one little box and have a diagnosis and an answer that's pat, that is just like, okay, this is what's going on. But how do you separate a person's physical health from their mental health, from their relationships, from their community, from their spiritual health, and all of it?
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. I think there's a myth in psychiatry, and that has been perpetuated, I believe, by the pharmaceutical industries as well, is that a person has, quote unquote, a brain chemical. Forget about the body. we're looking at just this, we're confining this problem to a brain, just one part of your body. Forget about everything else, which is incredibly dehumanizing and as such a narrow way to look at a person's mental health. Of course, it's impacted by their physical health and their diet. That's even completely discounted in psychiatry. Your diet doesn't mean anything, which many people, when they eliminate gluten and dairy and certain foods, they get better, even sugar. And so it's, oh yeah, eat a healthy diet or whatever, but it's almost like an afterthought. It's not really given its due that it deserves.
Yes.
And so it's a very, and then the other piece is even spirituality, for example. And I'm not saying in any religious sense. And if that's the case, that's fine. It's whatever you think is helpful to you to understand yourself and to understand and make sense of the world. That's completely cut off.
So at some stage then you changed. First of all, how did you get out of your situation then? You were in a bit of a deep hole then as far as all the drugs that people had pushed down your throat. How did you manage to climb out of that? Because really, by rights, you should still be in that hole.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I never really thought I could get out of it. And there were points where I felt I lost hope and I wasn't sure if I was actually going to make it. And it was really hard because I had, a beautiful daughter who was young. I was a professional. I was in a relationship. And here I was realizing, even as a clinician, that I'm in the same boat as my clients. There's no difference there in terms of like they're suffering and I'm suffering and I don't know what I have to offer them. So I also had this disillusionment about my own career. And I love what I do and I love working with people and helping my clients. But I didn't have something of substance and value to offer them because I was on the same boat, struggling and suffering and spinning my wheels in the system. And so I started really researching.
How can you tell other people what they should be doing when you are in the same hole as they are? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was really tough. And so what I did was I started really studying and researching, and it was almost like a fight for my life, and also realizing I want to be able to help people in a meaningful and impactful way. I don't want to continue to see them struggle. So I came across a lot of information online and communities of people who were, into carnivore, intermittent fasting, and many different things. And so for me, it was a 7-year journey and implementing a holistic approach. One of the first things that I did was I got off of birth control pill, which causes huge issues for many women, puts you at high risk for anxiety, depression, and suicide. So that was one of the major decisions that I made. Then I also gave up shift work, which is known to take about 10 years off of a person's life.
Yeah.
And then reset my sleep cycle. That is a huge step. I also implemented walking 5 to 10K a day, which was, I love walking and just being in nature. Then that
would have been quite difficult though with all the meds you were on, because they would have made you feel tired and lethargic and it's where these healthy people say, oh, you just go and exercise. It's like, well, I've got no energy. How can I exercise when I've got no energy because of all these meds that are down my throat?
Well, I was incredibly sedated most of the time and tired. I had very little energy, and I was sleeping probably about 12 to 13 hours a day. And I could just lay down and go to sleep anytime, anywhere. And I was 20 pounds heavier, so I could feel that in my joint. I'm a small person, so I could really feel that. And so absolutely, I think for many people, when they have that metabolic issue, it becomes impossible for them to even put any effort. They're just barely surviving and kind of functioning in the day-to-day.
I had a guest a couple of weeks ago called Robin, and she was bipolar. She was on all sorts of drugs, and she said she had an alarm to wake her up so she could take her kids to school. She came
Yeah.
home, went back to sleep, and another alarm to wake herself up so she could go and pick the kids up from school. And that's what her life was like for all of that time while she was on her meds. So that it's funny though. I hear different people, and it's the same story from different people's mouths.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's disheartening and it's incredibly frustrating and it can be a very hopeless place. And I can relate to what you're describing with this mom because during those years, I would say one of the most important things in my life was being a good mother. I have quite a significant trauma of history in my childhood, huge intergenerational trauma in my family. I'm originally from Ethiopia, and we left the country because of a civil war. My grandmother was in an arranged marriage by the time she was 9, had her first child when she was 14. We ended up in a refugee camp in Kenya for 2 years.
Wow.
And I also was physically abused from the time I was 4 until I was 16 when I left home. So for me, being a good mother was important and wanted to break that intergenerational cycle of trauma. And during that time when I was on that cocktail, I would say I became an absent mother. I was there physically, but emotionally, I was barely surviving. And I would say even more disturbing and incredibly shameful for me was not being the type of mother that I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And the shame was so devastating. And to me, around that piece of motherhood, that was when my daughter was 14 years old. I seriously considered suicide. I felt, you know what, she doesn't need a mother like that, and nobody needs me. I'm not really making much of a difference in my client's life. So I was in this existential crisis and questioned myself and my worth as a person and as a mother. And that was, I would say, the lowest point in my life. And that was when I started to really search for answers because it was either continue to live in this misery of an existence or figure out to get out of it for
Yeah.
myself and for the clients that I served.
And for your daughter.
Yeah, and for my daughter.
Hmm. Okay.
And yeah, and so and the other piece is that in terms of so these medications, people really not being aware of the full extent of what really they're signing up for, that is the issue. People don't realize that over time and the potential effects that this has on their health, that is not truly explained to them properly by clinicians. It's glossed over. And and so they kind of blindly go into it and then they're stuck in this place of
Hmm.
this hamster wheel of more
Yeah.
medications, more diagnosis, things getting worse and worse. And then people usually take it on to themselves that there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong with my brain, maybe I'm not a good person, this is why this has happened to me. There's an incredible amount of isolation, incredible amount of shame and stigma, and just a terrible state of existence
Hmm.
that comes with it.
Yeah. You were starting to talk before about how you're at rock bottom and you thought, well, what can I do? And you started, I guess, studying various, reading and studying and figuring out things about it.
Yeah, I started reading books. I started researching online. I came across a community of people that were teaching about carnivore, the ketogenic diet, such as The Brain Energy by Dr. Palmer. That's a
Mm-hmm.
book.
Yep,
Um,
I've read that.
yeah, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind by Dr. Georgia Ede. And Metabolic Mind on YouTube. There's lots of people actually nowadays. There's sort of an entire movement around this alternative approach. And so I came across that and I started implementing those things. And I was saying like there was a few different things I did, but one of those things was intermittent fasting, and another one was I went into carnivore, but I kept having reactive hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. So I
Right,
started
okay.
researching. Yeah, I think, I loved carnivore. It was excellent. And I would say most of my diet now is carnivore, it's animal products. But when I added a little bit of carbs for me with the ketogenic diet, like 20 to 50 grams of carbs or less, I also cut out gluten and dairy and sugar and processed foods and all those things. I was able to finally taper off of psychiatric medications, and it was medically supervised and by a physician and a pharmacist. And I had this incredible amount of energy, an incredible amount of just relief. My sleep was good. I went back to my ideal weight. My mental clarity, that was like a huge thing. I mean, I've always loved learning. I would say I'm a creative person, and I love just thinking about things and figuring things out. And so that capacity was greatly reduced during that time. And I was just, like I said, barely surviving. And to be able to have that energy to even do the work that I'm doing now in the past, 7, 8 months was incredible.
Yeah, okay. And so how long did that take you from starting out? And like you said, you had a bit of a problem there at the start with hypoglycemia, so that's a lack of sugar in your bloodstream. First of all, how did the hypoglycemia make you feel? I guess did it make you feel sluggish, or did it make you feel lightheaded, or both?
It was more lightheaded, and you get that kind of panicked feeling. You're diaphoretic, and just a couple of times I almost loss of consciousness, and so it was pretty serious. It was very low, and so I realized I need a little bit of carbs and a tiny, sugar that comes with it. And I think everybody is really different. I guess that's really the point. I learned diet is very important. It's a critical factor. And I think it's important for people to explore what works for them. And so I started on the carnivore because I felt that was probably a way, it's an elimination diet to see what actually,
Exactly. It's the elimination diet because you're getting rid of everything except for meat.
Yeah,
fat.
Meat, salt, and water. Yeah.
Exactly. And so if you're gluten intolerant or sugar intolerant or fiber intolerant, vegetables, tomatoes, all of the works, you're getting rid of the whole damn lot. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that was really eye-opening in terms of, I also had a continuous glucose monitor. And so I was really kind of paying attention to see how everything impacted my sugar levels and everything else, and monitoring and tracking a lot of different things. And so that process, and I really think that is important. People shouldn't go lightly into a carnivore or a ketogenic diet. There needs to be some preparation and tracking and proper medical monitoring to approach this kind of diet, especially if you're looking at it as an intervention for mental health. It can impact levels of medication. And so I would really highly suggest to people to do their research, or to even have somebody who has gone through the process as a coach and a mentor to help them in that process. And that's one of the things that I do today is I do support people not only to navigate, like I said, the current mental health system, but also to implement something like the ketogenic diet and other holistic approaches, and have that support and mentoring throughout that process to help them go through that.
Now, remember that this is part 1 of a 2-parter, and the second part will be on podcast number 37. If you want to be told when these things hit the air, then of course you can subscribe to my podcast channel. Alternatively, follow me on X, which is Keto Pete 2023. So that's KETOPETE PETE 2023, or follow me on Instagram on See Your Toes Again. Incidentally, as I have mentioned in other times, I'm a non-profit amateur podcaster, and it's quite bloody expensive, to be frank, with all the subscriptions that you need to get these podcasts on air. If there's any chance that you feel like helping me out, on the show notes there's a little line called Support the Show. If you felt like donating $3 or $5 towards a coffee, it would be much appreciated. It would really help out quite a bit. Anyhow, thank you very much for your time. Have a good day. Goodbye.